Yeah, I guess we can go ahead and get started. So hi, I'm Luke Valenta. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania, and I'll be presenting this work along with my co-author, Nick Sullivan.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for coming on this last day of Black Hat so early. We're going to talk today about this paper that we published together that's about elliptic curves. Now, elliptic curves are a cryptographic primitive that is absolutely fundamental to security and in the way that we do encryption online and in our businesses and everywhere around the world. So as the title suggests, this is a study of elliptic curve implementations in the wild. And specifically, we're looking at an algorithm called the elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange and how it's being used in the real world. And chances are you're using this algorithm every day to secure your connections to work machines, browsing the internet, almost everything. This wasn't the case 10 years ago, but within the last 5 years, elliptic curves have become increasingly important. So, elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, what is this? Well, this is, suppose we have, our classic pair of communiques, Alice and Bob, and an eavesdropper Eve. So we have Alice who wants to talk to, who's a client, who wants to talk to a server Bob over the public internet. And we also have Eve who wants to snoop on the messages between Alice and Bob. So to secure their connections, Alice and Bob want to negotiate a shared key and use that to encrypt the messages. And they can do this using elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. First, they decide on what, there we go. This kind of, sorry, I accidentally touched this wire. Okay. Just give it a second. Okay, great. I will not touch that wire again. First, they decide on a curve to use for key exchange. So Bob chooses a secret key, B, and uses it to compute a point on the curve. Now, a curve is really what you traditionally think of as a curve. So it's an equation. Specifically, an elliptic curve is an equation with x squared and y cubed and a couple of other smaller parameters. So you can use points on these curves and you can kind of add them together and multiply them together. So this is how elliptic curve crypto works. So Alice chooses a point B and takes a point on the curve and multiplies it or adds it to itself B times, and that becomes the public point. So Bob chooses the secret key, computes the public point P, and then sends that to Alice. Alice sends it to Bob, and Bob does sort of the same thing, computes the same point and adds it, multiplies it by its secret value. So the really good thing about elliptic curves and the fundamental security property that you have here is that if you take B times P or A times P, you can't get B or A back. So B and A are the secret keys. B times P, A times P are the public keys. Now, Alice and Bob can then each multiply this public key by their own secret key, and these values end up being the same due to the commutative property. So you have A times BP, B times AP, and these end up being the same value. And the security relies on what's called the computational Diffie-Hellman assumption, which is a mathematical assumption that says that given A times P, B times P, and the curve parameters, the attacker shouldn't be able to learn the shared secret. Now, let's look at some attacks and defenses against this protocol. First, it's vulnerable to what's called a naive man-in-the-middle attack. So if Eve is no longer just an eavesdropper, Eve is actually sitting in between these communications. Eve then transforms into the character we call Mallory. So let's promote Eve to Mallory. Mallory can intercept all messages between Alice and Bob. So in order to attack this protocol, she can simply negotiate a separate key exchange with both Alice and Bob, decrypting and re-encrypting the traffic. And the issue here is that Alice and Bob have no way of knowing who exactly that they're talking to, because there's no way to know a priori what B times P is actually from Bob and A times P is actually from Alice. So you can kind of swap these things together. So what is the defense here? Well, the fix is we can add authentication to this key exchange. So Alice and Bob can each sign their key exchange values with certificates or host keys. So since there's a signature on these values and a known public key, Mallory there in the middle can't actually manipulate it and change these values. So Diffie-Hellman needs to be authenticated, or else it's secure against a Mallory, a sort of man-in-the-middle type of attacker. Okay, so what they can do at this point is they can use this negotiated share secret to compute a message authentication code. Basically, a checksum that's only somebody with the shared secret will know on the message transcripts, and use that to ensure that the messages are not tampered with from that point forward. So now let's look at how Alice and Bob decide on which elliptic curve to use. In this diagram, there's sort of an assumption that they're using the same elliptic curve. There are different types of elliptic curves with different properties, and you can have multiple different elliptic curves. So one example of a protocol that uses this type of negotiation is TLS, which is the protocol for HTTPS secure communications online for the web. So how it works in TLS is Alice sends a list of curves that is supported, and Bob then chooses one of the curves and says, okay, this is the curve that we're going to negotiate a handshake with. And so usually Bob will choose the strongest of these curves. And this is what makes TLS a good protocol in order to negotiate properly, is whoever chooses the curve to use typically chooses the strongest one of these. So, however, some protocols, including TLS 1.2, which is the previously most well-known version of TLS. Right now we're at TLS 1.3, which just came out. But in TLS 1.2, these curve negotiation messages are not actually covered by this message authentication code. So there's a potential to tamper with these and maybe figure out how to attack this. And this is an attack I presented 3 years ago at the Chaos Communication Congress. And the idea is that TLS clients and TLS servers support a wide variety of elliptic curves. And if the attacker were to sit in the middle and force both parties to choose the weakest of these curves, and if this curve is weak enough to actually attack immediately, then you can force a downgrade attack and actually upgrade your attack into a man-in-the-middle attack that actually works. So this is a proposed attack that I put together. I didn't have any practical implementation of this. It was just, this is a theory, let's kind of check it out. So let's spell out exactly how this would work. So Alice sends the three curves, one of which is very weak, to the man-in-the-middle Mallory, and Mallory intercepts it and deletes from this negotiation everything except for the weakest of the curves. And then so when Bob receives this list, he sees nothing wrong with it since he also supports this weak curve, and then computes a key exchange with it. And then Mallory does the same, and Mallory just forwards the message along. And now before Alice and Bob can compute a shared secret, this curve is weak enough, then Mallory can actually solve this Diffie-Hellman, computational Diffie-Hellman problem. If it's a weak curve, you can go from A times P and extract A. And that breaks the security of this entire thing. And so when these message authentication codes come back, that's actually only protected by the shared secret. And because the shared secret can be computed by the attacker, you get in this situation where this man-in-the-middle attack actually works. And so from here, I contacted Luke and said, let's try to figure out whether or not this attack is actually feasible in the wild and what sort of things that have folks done incorrectly in order to facilitate this attack. And so with that, I'll pass it to Luke.
Great. So in this work, we wanted to evaluate the practical feasibility of the CurveSwap attack in the wild. So remember, this requires us to be able to break ECDH for some curve that's supported by both clients and servers. So we looked at ECDH in multiple protocols. So TLS, which is used for web assets, dashboards, and portals, SSH, which you might use for production access or developer operations, IPsec, which is used for VPN services, and JWE for web applications. In this work, we measured elliptic curve usage and hosts using internet scanning, and we used passive measurement to look at clients, and we also looked at library implementations by examining source code. So if you want to zone out now for the rest of the talk, the punchline is that we found a lot of weaknesses in elliptic curve implementations, but we didn't actually find anybody vulnerable to a full practical CurveSwap attack. So this is sort of a negative result, which is actually really good for the security of the internet. So we had this theoretical attack, tried to find it in the wild, and didn't quite find it, but we got close. So for our internet scanning measurements, we use the ZMAP toolchain. So this allowed us to quickly scan all the publicly available hosts on the IPv4 internet from our university network. So first, to give you an idea of what elliptic curve usage looks like on the internet, or at the time of our study. So we first, I guess in the first column, we have the number of hosts that we were able to contact for each of these protocols, to contact at all. So for HTTPS, we were able to contact 41 million hosts. And of these, 28.8 million supported ECDH at all. So to measure the support for individual curves here, we just, as a client, we sent a client hello offering only a single curve at a time and saw which servers would talk to us with this curve. So you can see that SECP 256R1 is the most popular curve across all of these protocols. This is one of the NIST standardized curves. SCCP 224R1 also has some pretty widespread support in IKV1, but not so much in the other protocols. And at the time of our measurements, curve 25519 has a lot of support in SSH and increasing support in HTTPS. So one interesting thing, a side note, we found when we were doing these scans, we found that 8.5 million HTTPS hosts, when we sent them a particular curve, they just responded back with one of these three NIST curves, regardless of whatever curve we sent as a client. We couldn't figure out a way that this was a real vulnerability, but it's definitely not standards compliant behavior. I rescanned a few of these hosts in April and found they were all behind the same CDN, which must have, it's since patched this behavior. So now back to the CurveSwap attack. So if you remember, it requires us to be able to break ECDH for some supported curve. So we look at two attack vectors for doing this. The first is to directly solve the discrete log on a weak curve to learn the server's secret key. A second approach we can use is to use an invalid point attack. So I'll explain a bit more what these are in a bit. But here, a malicious client sends a special point to the server, and if the server takes that point and does the point multiplication with it, it might leak some information about its secret key from the output. Now, for both of these techniques to be effective, we need the server to also reuse the same private key for multiple connections or over some period of time. And so why would a server do this? Well, it turns out that computing a new secret key and public key pair for each new connection that comes in can be pretty expensive. So for a server that handles thousands of requests per second, then it might just cache the same private and public key and use them for many connections. This is pretty common server behavior. So the first thing we wanted to look at is if servers reuse keys. So to check this, we scanned the IPv4 internet twice in rapid succession and just checked to see if the server sent back the same key twice. So of the TLS hosts that supported this really popular NIST curve, we found that 22% of them reused keys at least once when we hit them twice with these scans. And also interestingly, we found that that 640,000 of them reuse the same key as another host within the same scan. So this could be due to load balancing behavior, or maybe there's some other explanations. So it does look like servers are reusing keys. So we have one piece of the puzzle here. So now let's look at our first attack vector, which is solving the discrete logarithm directly on some weak curves. So the discrete log problem is that given the curve parameters and a point on the curve, BP, we want to recompute the private key B. So the best generic algorithm we have for this, which is the best algorithm we have for elliptic curves, runs in O of square root of n time for a curve with n points. So for a 256-bit curve, this algorithm will run in about time 2 to the 128. So as we noted earlier, TLS supports a ton of really weak elliptic curves. In particular, here's one curve, SCCP 160R1, which only has 80-bit security. Now, just for some comparison, the Bitcoin network does 2 to the 80 work about twice a day. And 128-bit security is really the weakest security you want to use for any application. So you don't really want this curve encrypting your traffic. So out of we sampled some client hellos from Cloudflare. Out of 4 million client hellos, we found that over 16% of them were offering to support this really weak elliptic curve. We also looked at servers, and we found that then almost 1% of them supported this weak curve. And of these, over 8,000 also reuse keys. And when we rescanned again these hosts after 25 hours, we found that only 2 of them were still reusing keys. So for these hosts, if we were able to solve the discrete log on this 160-bit curve, or this curve with 80-bit security in under 25 hours, then we would be able to do the CurveSwap downgrade attack. However, it's still not quite a practical attack because I don't have the power of the Bitcoin network in my lab. So next attack vector we look at are invalid point attacks. So the way I'm going to explain this is that some implementations are curve blind. This is my own terminology. You won't find it in the literature. But basically it means that you lack the validation checks between to differentiate between these two curves, this green curve and this red curve. So those in the audience who are colorblind, you can feel the pain now. So the attack works as follows. We have a malicious client, Mallory, and our server, Bob. So Mallory starts a key exchange with this green curve. Bob accepts the green curve and computes his key exchange values on it. Now, instead of sending a point on the green curve, Mallory sends a point P on a red curve instead, where this red curve is designed to be weak. So now, although Bob doesn't support the red curve, he can't tell the difference between the red curve and the green curve because he's curve blind. So he computes the shared secret on that curve instead. Now, when he sends a MAC of the message transcript to Mallory, since she's chosen the curve to be super weak, she can now brute force over all possible values of KS and discover what B is on this weak curve instead. So this allows her to recover a few bits of B. And she can repeat this attack with many different weak red curves and recover the full secret value B using the Chinese remainder theorem. So now you might ask, why would implementations ever be curve blind? Well, the countermeasures are actually built into almost all of the standards that describe elliptic curve usage. So for TLS, it says that the server retrieves the client's ephemeral ECDH public key from the client key exchange message and checks that it's on the same elliptic curve as the server's ECDH key. There are similar warnings for SSH and IPv2. We found that the JWE, the JSON Web Encryption standards, just didn't have this warning anywhere. So we'll see what the impact of this is on the next slide. So we looked at whether libraries heeded the warnings in the RFCs and actually did these validation checks. In some past work by Jaeger, Schwenk, and Soborowski, they showed that a lot of TLS libraries failed to include these checks for elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. And some of my co-authors and I showed in a paper that this also holds for finite field Diffie-Hellman, that the validation checks just aren't really performed by libraries. And then in this work, we looked at JWE, where the warning isn't even included in the standard. And we found that of 6 libraries we looked at that supported elliptic curve crypto, 5 of them didn't do the validation checks and were vulnerable to this attack. So now we use internet scanning to see if hosts in the wild validated public keys. So our scanning methodology was to test for 2 different types of curve blindness. So we send these low order points on an invalid curve related to the NIST curve, and also on the twists of the curve. So you don't really need to know what that means. So the correct behavior for a host when it receives one of these invalid points is to shut down the connection. So we found for HTTPS that almost 200,000 hosts accepted these invalid points. And so they would be vulnerable to this invalid curve attack. We found that a large percentage of IPv2 hosts also did this, along with a few in SSH and IPv1. So for SSH and IPsec, for these hosts, we're not 100% sure that they're vulnerable because of how the protocol works. We weren't able to actually confirm that the attack worked, but they didn't shut down the connection immediately when we sent the invalid point. So it's a good indication that they might be vulnerable. So for the for the CurveSwap attack to work, we need hosts to both not validate public keys and to reuse the same key for multiple connections. And fortunately, we didn't find any hosts that actually did this. So the CurveSwap attack, we didn't find any hosts vulnerable to the CurveSwap attack in this way in the real world. So now you might ask why these protocols are designed in a way that makes it so easy for implementations to make mistakes like this. So there's some good news here with these newly designed curves like Curve 25519 and Curve 448. They're actually designed in a way to avoid all of these twist and invalid curve attacks. So they're gaining widespread support, where Curve 25519 and Curve 448 were recently chosen by the IETF for inclusion in all future protocols. They're included in the TLS 1.3 standard as well. So at the time of our study, Curve 25519 was supported by over 77% of SSH hosts and a few percent of HTTPS hosts. But these numbers are now much higher. All right, so now for some takeaways from the talk. So for standards developers, just know that it's really easy for developers to omit these validation checks and extra complexities in the protocol. So if it's not required for correctness, then the validation checks might not make it into the implementation. So the best way to prevent this is to include the test vectors as part of the standards. So to be standards compliant, you have to be invulnerable to these attacks. A second approach for protocols is to only support secure curves. So ideally, you just want to support one secure curve, so you can't do this sort of downgrade attack to the weakest parameters that you support. And also, protocols should be designed with proper downgrade protection. So TLS 1.3 includes an extra signature at the end of the entire transcript that prevents downgrade attacks like the CurveSwap attack. For software developers, you should add cryptographic validation to your test suite. So So Project Wishaproof makes this really easy. They have a suite, or yeah, this full suite of test vectors against a whole bunch of different implementations of cryptographic primitives that you can easily import into your project. And also, you should really consult a cryptographer for any use of cryptographic primitives and search a little bit more widely than the exact standard that you're implementing to figure out how to correctly use these primitives. And finally, for security researchers, using open source tools like ZMAP as part of your security analysis can let you, it's an effective way to black box, or to, for black box testing implementations. So it should really be part of your tool chain. And with that, we can take any questions. Thanks. All right. Great. All right. Yeah, if there are no questions, then you can find us afterwards if you'd like to ask us anything. Yeah. Thank you.